So, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today as Troy gives us some perspective on grazing cover crops in the Northeast. My name is Anne Marie Calabro. I'm a soil health educator with the Soil Health Institute. My colleagues here, Erin Gundy, also with the Soil Health Institute, and Olivia Cayuet with the University of Missouri Center for Regenerative Agriculture. That's a lot to say. Are also on the call providing some technical support in the background. So we three support the education component of Farmers for Soil Health. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide you all with an overview of grazing cover crops and give you some insights on how this practice can be utilized to enhance soil health while providing high quality forage for livestock. Today's webinar, excuse me, is supported by Farmers for Soil Health, or FSH. This initiative is one of many USDA-funded partnerships for climate smart commodities projects. FSH is a collaborative initiative of commodity organizations, the United Soybean Board, the National Corn Growers Association, and the National Pork Board, all with a common goal to increase cover crop adoption. This specific project provides an incentive to farmers who are new to planting cover crops or have been planting cover crops for many years. State level commodity organizations and conservation professionals are working across 20 states from North Dakota to the East Coast to provide local technical assistance and outreach programming. FSH has also developed a website full of resources and information for you to access. So you can learn more about FSH at the farmersforsoilhealth.com website. That should pop up in your chat. Enrollment right now for fall 2024 fall planted cover crops is open through February 28th. And, lastly, just a few items about this event. The presentation is being recorded, and an email will be sent in the next week with a link to the webinar recording that will be posted on SHI's YouTube channel, along with a final feedback survey. We will have some time at the end for questions. So utilize the Q&A box as your questions come up, type in your questions. You can upvote other questions that, other people ask if you want us to prioritize them when we try and get to all your questions live. Other than that, if you run into any sort of technical issues, don't hesitate to chat our webinar co-hosts, and they'll work to resolve any of the issues in the background. If you want your captions on, you can do so by clicking the three little dots on the bottom of the screen and navigating to captions. Make sure you hang on to the end if you're interested in getting certified crop advisor credit. We have one available for soil and water continuing education, and that will be one of the last slides of this presentation. With all that being said, I'm excited to turn it over to our guests, Troy Bishop and Klaus Martin. Go ahead, Troy, take it away.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All good?
All good.
Thank you. So welcome everybody. I see there's about 40 of you. I'm going to listen to a seasoned grazer. I've been at it 40 years as a practitioner, and also 20 years as a soil and water grazing specialist here in New York and in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And now I'm part of the team with the National Grazing Lands Coalition. And on the line, we'll get to Klaus Martin, one of my cover crop mentors. A little bit later, he's going to talk a little bit about species selection and those types of things. So it's going to be a little bit different. My experience with cover crops is limited, and what gives me hope is there's a lot of opportunity, But generally, I'm a perennialist. That's not even, I saw in Google, that's not even a word, but I guess I've made it up. So I've worked in perennials, grass systems, and hay systems pretty much my whole life. When things get kind of crazy with the weather, or you do some damage with bale grazing or stuff, we add seed. Um, I'm always working within grasslands. So it's a little bit out of context that I'm in this context, but then I wanted to give you the context. So the other part of my journey in life here has been more of a student. So I have seen a lot of cover crop applications, and I'm going to kind of break down some of the experiences that I've seen. And I also talk with a lot of professionals, farmers that are away from the Northeast to get insight on what can actually work here. And so that gives you a little context. I work with a lot of small farms as far as doing cover crops. A lot of those farms are dairy centric, so a lot of organic dairies. We don't have big acreages. A lot of times, small farms can be a couple hundred acres. A lot of times, cover crops or those types of applications are a 5 acre field here and there. I listen to a lot of cover crop YouTube channels, and there's a lot of scale. We're a little bit smaller than that. The grazing cover crops for us is pretty farm specific. Requires a ton of planning, timing, and it's super highly weather dependent here in the Northeast because we got a short growing season. So there's definitely some challenges in the last 5 years, not this year. Hey, we got real winter. The last 5 years we've had perpetual November where we have no frozen ground, lots of mud, and it's been a real challenge animal welfare wise to have animals just outside in general. It's very, very unfriendly for the environment and the animals in the rainy, snowy, weird climate we're having. Um, I've seen a lot of stuff. The results of cover crop grazing and cover crop implementation is very variable, highly variable. What I've seen, and to go along with that high variability and getting a crop established enough to graze, we have very limited grazing infrastructure in our fields, especially the stuff that we're going to talk about with larger fields. Our crop farmer partners, potential partners, there's no infrastructure left. So we gotta think a lot about that. And infrastructure means fencing, water, transportation, catch pens, um, hedgerows, all the things uh, that someone would have livestock on land. So, and we also have a customer base here in the Northeast. There's a lot of them. So they're driving down roads. There's a lot more people and there's a lot more risk. Um, the grazing cover crops, I've been watching a lot of the financials from the other webinars. We tend to be more expensive. I don't know why that is. A lot of us in conservation have to use certified seed. So bin run seed is cheaper. We have smaller fields. We can't use as big of equipment to get stuff drilled or spread for these time periods. There's some financial considerations we want to take a look at. Um, but after all that, there's a ton of opportunity. We have a ton of crop farmers throughout the state, throughout the Northeast that could help us livestock farmers grow more protein. And so there's a ton of that. Custom grazing is definitely one of those targets that I could aspire to. So, but we have to kind of overcome some of these other obstacles. Most of you know, most of you know that cover crop grazing is good. Um, I call it. I got this from Kirsten Workman the other day. She called it poop, hooves, diversity, and saliva. Oh my. So the biological part of animals grazing is great for the land and the plants. We know that building organic matter is key. These cover crops, these potential cover crops definitely reduce pressure from grazing land. Grazing, when you're short on land or you want to bolster during the non-growing season or get a jump in the spring or you're having terrible weather conditions like dry weather or whatever. The crops can increase animal performance when managed correctly, and it has the potential to lower the feed costs, which this slide came out of Virginia last week. I kind of scratched my head that it's costing us $1,120 per cow calf pair to keep alive for a year. So that needs to be reduced if we're going to stay viable. Not to be the negative Nelly, but why not cover crops? And these are not necessarily my opinions. I have talked to hundreds of farmers around the Northeast. Liability of having animals out on land, um, especially if it's cropland or someone else's cropland, the risk that it entails. There's definitely costs that are associated with implementing cover crops or seeding rates. There's animal welfare concerns. Folks driving down the road, they see animals out when it's maybe not the best weather. They make a phone call, and I've been involved in that a couple times. Not fun. When people have an idea that there should be a barn. So those are definite. There's some soil compaction issues depending on the weather. Uh, that's pretty well noted. So these practices are very weather dependent and site specific. Most of us hate mud, so it's great if it's dry or frozen, you can graze really well. But mud has we get stressed out with mud, and if it keeps raining, how are we going to get the animals out of there? Like I said before, the grazing infrastructure is limited. Not that it can't be done. The management challenges. Do people want to manage animals out on cover crops? That's a whole nother, if they're busy doing other things on the farm. Um, again, there's challenges. Transportation in and out of these areas has a potential for a hassle. Um, we in New York and a lot of places, we have a lot of CAFOs, and we would love to get some cows out of barns and onto cover crops. But there's some rules that entail having animals that are in housing and out on the land. I think that'd be a great thing, but there's certain rules about nutrient management plans and things that need to be addressed. And I'll say that there's a lack of practitioners here in the Northeast, at least that I'm aware of, that are doing it and doing it successfully that we can all learn from. So that's definitely an opportunity. One narrative from our region, it's strong in our region that we grow cover crops to spread manure. That's a big focus on why we get cereal rise and that in the fall, because we want to let them grow and we want to plow down and manure those cover crops for soil health, not necessarily grazing. So there is definitely um, not it's not stress, but it's just another way of doing things that's pretty prevalent in our region. The other thing is if we're not going to put animals on these cover crops to graze, a lot of farms are basically growing cover crops to get manure on and to harvest. So they're harvesting a couple tons or 3, 4 tons in the spring and then getting it right back into corn. So we are a corn silage state, and our region is definitely corn silage rich. So it's a multitude of other narratives. The way I look at it, utilizing cover crops for grazing animals, it's not an all or nothing. You can use cover crops on a 5 acre field, a 3 acre vegetable field, 100 acre field of corn, corn stubble. There's just a lot of nuances that we can make ourselves more resilient by using these cover crops. Gabe Brown, a friend of mine, he says, do your homework. So there's a lot of considerations we need. That's why it's important to talk amongst ourselves and learn from these webinars. And there's so many good people that are much practiced that learn from. I think it's really important that we get that homework. So, I'd like you to introduce Klaus Martin. As far as homework goes, him and I have talked several times about what kind of species selection to use for grazing, when to plant, what are the windows, and some of his perspectives and opportunities, because he's been doing this a long time out in Penyan. So, can you hop right in there, Klaus, and
Yeah, yeah,
tell us?
I'm happy to jump in.
Thank you.
I learned this from my father, and I'll give you a little historical context. When my father started out on a really poor hill farm where forage was always very scarce, and he kind of died and went to heaven when he moved onto better land. And the first thing he did was put a perimeter fence around his entire farm and a lane and a cow lane down the center so that he could pasture any field on the farm at any time. And he would, he knew that every day that the heifers or the cows were outside was one day that he wasn't pitching manure by hand. He never had a manure loader till he got older. And he was growing row crops during the 4 main growing season months of the year, but he was also using his land the other 8 months. And I tell farmers this when they object to growing cover crops. I tell them, you're paying taxes on the land for 12 months. Why are you only using it for 4? And another observation I'd like to make is that the soil doesn't know and doesn't care if we're calling something a crop, a cover crop, or a weed. Every plant has an impact on the soil. And to quote one of the old masters of organic farming, one of the pioneers was William Albrecht. And he used to tell people that if their fields were not growing something green at the end of the year when after the corn was harvested, that their land was headed downhill and that their soil needed, if nothing else, at least the services of the weeds that would grow on these fields because of the root exudates. And I'll give you a little bit of the science. Plants give off between half, up to half, but at least 30% of the photosynthesis that they collect in the form of root exudates. And those root exudates are food so that the roots of the plants, and that's universal, weeds, crops, and everything else, recruit microbes. And those microbes around the roots are building soil crumb structure. They're building capillaries. They're maintaining the air movement. They're supplying minerals for the plant. They're helping the plant actually access some of the fertility that's there. And they basically do all that for nothing, but they're collecting solar energy and using it in a positive way. And I really believe that one of our big issues with soil health is that we're growing quote, cash crops, and then leaving the land bare, not doing anything the rest of the year. And that's taking us downhill. And it's a missed opportunity because there's an opportunity there for income. So when my father fenced the perimeter of the farm, he would turn the heifers out, and I'll back up. There was a common practice until the 1960s when residual herbicides were used, in this, at least in our area, was to broadcast ryegrass at second cultivation, just before the corn closed the rows. And that ryegrass was very tough. It would survive in the shade. And of course, by fall, when the corn was ripening and the leaves were drying up, then it would be getting sunlight and grow. And ryegrass can grow when the temperature is about 34 degrees, it'll grow. And by fall, a lot of these fields had a beautiful stand of high quality forage on them, but they also had the crop residue, the corn stalks. And in those days, corn didn't stand real good, and there would be dropped ears and field loss, which my father never worried about because he said the cows are going to go get that stuff anyway when we're done. So he would wait until the conditions were right. He didn't let the cows out when they were going to punch the fields, but he would let the heifers and dry cows out onto these cornfields that had weeds and grass growing in the corn and the crop residue in those. Every day that it was possible to be out there, he'd have them out. And, back to, he was avoiding pitching manure at that time. He was putting the manure directly on the fields, and they were eating. And he didn't feed them a whole lot some days because they were getting all they wanted out in the fields. And some years it was too wet a lot of the time, and he didn't let them out when the conditions weren't right. But whenever the conditions were right, he had them out there harvesting. So that was an older concept. And I still remember, and this is a little piece of historical concept, the abstract title to a farm that we bought in the deed had an old farmer sold it. And in there, the farmer retained the right to grazing the stumpage, which was basically the right to graze the cover crops or the crop residues and weeds and anything that was growing there over winter. And they were reserving life use of the farm for winter grazing. So
Nice.
that's something we could learn from the past on this.
What are your been happy with as far as grazing species now in these mixes from your experience?
Well, they all have benefits. This year I call it a home run. We ran out of pasture about early October, where we had a really good grazing season. The heifers were doing real good, and I wasn't feeding a whole lot other than the pasture. But the grass kind of ran out of steam by early October. And I'll have to back up a little. Our farm has a stream through the middle of it, and it's the richest land on the farm, but we really shouldn't be plowing it because it floods. So I've got just a 10-acre, it's about 10 acres, but it's the floodplain, is permanent pasture that I've got fenced off. And it's kind of backwards of what most people would think because it's the center of the farm. But I use that to maintain the cattle lanes, and that gives those pastures, gives the cows access to all of the fields around the pastures where I grow my crops. So this year we had medium red clover seeded in wheat on several fields that bordered our grazing area, the floodplain. And up the middle of the grazing area, I put an improved cattle lane. It's an NRCS practice, and it's a really good practice. That I changed the design a little bit to keep it drier during wet weather, but the cattle can be moved easily anywhere without, even when it's wet, without doing damage with their hooves because of this improved laneway that's fenced and comes up through. But I had this medium red clover that had been in wheat, and when I ran out of pasture, I put the cows out, and they did not eat anything that I fed to them from the time they were on that clover until it was well into December. They were going out when and knocking the snow off the clover to eat it because they liked it so well. And I got about 8 weeks of 0 feed bill, and the cows gained like crazy on this because it was really hot, rich feed. I would have grazed a little longer, but I had a neighbor, as Troy, you mentioned, some people have issues with seeing cows out when it's cold. This neighbor was petrified that they were going to get into her lawn and lawnmower might tip over in some of the holes they made when they punched it. But so rather than make trouble, we stopped doing that. She's old. We have to give her a little bit of space. But that was one of those really big windfalls because I had virtually 0 cost except managing the cows. And I think we need to keep in mind there was some times when it was wet, but if they only spend a day on an area that they're going to harvest, and then they go on the next area the next day, we're really not doing a lot of damage as long as we have laneways that are improved and able to take the traffic. And this is all, the devil's always in the detail. And I think in grazing, there's an enormous opportunity to make profit through management, where our input is really minimal labor and minimal material, but a lot of management. And this management, it's experience, but it's also things that neighbors can share. You can see what works on one farm or another. And the other thing is, I know there always was this race of hauling manure in the spring, and we talk about cows punching fields. Well, manure spreaders and big tractors, they get stuck, do quite a lot of damage too, especially when you're out there a little too early, and then they can't wait to plow after you're done and try to clean the mess up. And I would think cows that spend a day lightly grazing an area and then get moved on to the next one lightly grazing are doing less damage than that tractor and manure spreader that gets stuck quite often. And also, and this goes back to my father's practices, you can pay attention to when the ground is frozen, and on the worst days, you just bring them some feed and don't run them out there when they're going to do damage, or just run them overnight when it's frozen hard at night. Pay attention to when they're out there and what they're doing. And these are all little things. But as far as the species, I love clover, but when it gets colder, you get a couple of really hard frosts and that clover disappears fairly fast. But we've got a whole group of other plants that don't have that issue. And I've talked to people about marrow-stem kale. And I know this is a backbone of some of the dairy operations in the wintertime in New Zealand, where marrow-stem kale will grow about 5 to 6 feet tall. And that can be grazed all winter long. The cows actually love it, and they learn to eat the leaves off it. To me, that's one of those opportunity crops. You don't want to plant it by itself. You want to have other things with it, because it's actually too rich to be the only diet that a cow gets. It has a feed value almost as high as grain, almost as high as oats, actually. And you don't want a cow just getting that. You want to have some other things with it. Fall planted oats be a good mix with it. It has a root system that complements the roots of the marrow-stem kale. More common crop would be turnips. A winter mixture in the fall of oats, turnips, village radish. You could throw in forage rape, and there's a whole host of crops. Little rye, triticale doesn't hurt at all in a mix like that. In fact, rye and triticale is a great idea because that would come back the next spring and give you another shot of free feed when you're done. But to me, the challenge is to try to have things that allow us to feed them high quality feed as late into the year or for as much of the winter as possible. And I think when people start worrying about the damage of the traffic, that's got more to do with their day-to-day management and the planning than it does with the actual practice. And you can do any practice poorly or well. That's all management.
Yeah.
So,
and you had said before, we talked about your area as a great area of dairy and crop farms in the Finger Lakes. And you had said that there's a lot of opportunity there. What's limiting our opportunity for partnering with our crop farmer neighbors?
Yeah, so this is a missed opportunity, and I think the limiting factor is we need to come up with some minimum shelter for the animals. You know, in order to manage like I've described, there should be an area where the animals can be brought supplemental feed, you know, some material, either have an area that's hard that can be bedded, but, you know, cows need to be clean, dry, and comfortable. And, you know, during the periods when it's snowing and raining, there needs to be a way to meet their general needs. You've got to have water that's not going to freeze available to the animals. You've got to have a source of minerals and salt. You know, all of these basic things. And farmers, unfortunately, have not thought ahead for that kind of infrastructure. But it's minimal investment against the benefits that you can get because you're harvesting a whole other crop. I've done calculations on how much feed can be provided in addition to the main crop. And I hesitate to call it cover crops. The cover crops implies that there's something that you spend money on that you're not making anything on. These are cash crops. You know, when a cow gains, you're gaining. I mean, you're avoiding a feed cost at very least.
Yep.
So but we do need to, like I mentioned, we need to have a good solid laneway for the cattle to be able to travel. We need to have a way to manage them so they're not punching the same area up every day, you know, that they come onto new ground. But this is all management. These are not expensive inputs. These are things that can be done. And a lot of times a farm might have an old farmstead or an old yard that's already got some of the services like a well needed. But again, it all takes forethought and management, but it's a huge opportunity. And I'm going to digress on this. There is an opportunity more farmers are taking, and that's growing a second crop, like triticale and ryegrass mixed, or triticale and winter peas, or some of these mixtures I mentioned. And they'll harvest those crops with a forage harvester and bring them to sell them or bring them to the cows. Now, the problem with selling them onto another farm is there's an old Vermont or New England joke that you can buy the neighbor's farm one bale at a time.
Yeah.
You know, if you have all that stuff leaving the farm, it's not doing you a lot of good. When the cows graze, you're saving those minerals. They're being upgraded, and you're actually gaining fertility. But also, when they're grazing, you're saving a ton of money. My best calculation is if I've got a very high yield of forage out there, it's going to cost me $50 a ton. And if I've got a poor yield, it can cost me $100 a ton to harvest it. Those cows don't charge me a thing except the cost of running the fence and my management.
Yeah.
You know, then again, these are opportunities. The difference between making money and losing money quite often is between our ears.
Yeah.
Whether we take an opportunity or screw it up. And that's where you come in, Troy. You know what these cows need physically, and I think you could look at a system and advise on how to maximize the opportunity.
Well, I can't wait for us to work together more, Klaus. I'm gonna move on, and thank you for your perspective.
Well, thank you.
Well, Troy, before you do move on, we have one quick question for
Perfect.
Klaus about his watering system in the cover cropped field when he turns the cows out there. How do you accomplish having water that doesn't freeze in those fields that aren't necessarily set up for permanent grazing?
Well, because our setup has this floodplain that I graze in the center and the cow lane, I make them come back to the center, you know, where I have my well and I have frost-free waterers there. And what I'm finding is these cover crops, I'm catching myself. They're forage crops. These forage crops have a lot of water, and I've been getting away with just making them walk to get their drink. I'm not doing this with milking dairy cows with them, I would have to get the water out. But I think I have a good solution if we had to water them on site. And that's, it doesn't take much of a bird bath waterer. If we use a tank that's got minimal insulation and is partly covered, a bird bath waterer with a relatively small electric source will stay open in some pretty cold weather. And, something like that could be moved on wheels and brought back out. But I'm just lazy. I've got a system that works very well, without me having to do a whole lot of effort. But of course, it's all in the management and design of the system. I think Troy might have better suggestions than I do how to do it in rougher conditions.
Thank you. All good, Anne Marie?
10-4.
Okay. Well, thanks, Klaus.
You're welcome.
To have any management in this grazing forage crops now, not cover crops, we need a grazing plan. And there's a lot of folks on here that know what a grazing plan is. A grazing plan is generally what do the animals need? Not necessarily cows, but any animal. And what does the land and the forage supply, and trying to optimize those two components, then come up with an acreage figure. And then how does it fit into a whole farm plan, meaning grazing cover crops, forage crops are just part of the overall grazing, can be grazing hay fields, permanent pasture fields, and these cover crop fields, or moving animals off to another crop farm even. So having a grazing plan is really one of those things that we all need. I've been in touch with some nutritionists, namely Karen Hoffman from NRCS, who knows a lot about animal nutrition. These cover crops are highly nutritious, almost to the point of too nutritious. So you can just imagine any animal class getting into something very juicy and wet, that they might have a little bellyache now and then. So that's where the management comes into this idea of grazing cover crops. I have heard of folks just putting animals out and letting them have the whole field, which is definitely something a lot of farms do, where they can come back to a water point. But these kind of crops that we're looking at here, a lot of them are very nutritious, and they need a lot more management, meaning they need some care in how much an animal will eat. Will the animal have enough minerals? Will it have enough some fiber in its diet to be able to assimilate this? You don't want to put hungry animals out on something like that. You'll have a wreck. You can actually let some of these crops go a little longer, so they won't have quite as much high sugar, high protein, but it's definitely something to consult a nutritionist about, and have some plans on hand. Again, depending on the year, depending on the species. Klaus mentioned clover, red clover. I mean, you gotta watch red clover. That's why when he talked about mixtures, mixtures are a lot nicer, meaning they can defray some of those protein problems. And the other part of New York agriculture, or Northeast agriculture in general, we got a lot of diversity in animals, and so whether you have sheep, beef, dairy heifers, pastured poultry. There's a lot of places for pastured poultry or turkeys. There's everything loves cover crops, I would say. Everything likes grass. And why not add value actually to a lot of these crop fields? Some of these wouldn't require quite the fencing infrastructure, especially if it was close to your farm. So again, a lot of opportunities. I've got this favorite field that I've watched for 20 years. It's almost always a cornfield. So I did a little grazing planning and maybe a little financial. Again, take it with a little bit of grain of salt here. But my vision was, boy, it could really use a fence. So I went on Google Earth and I measured this field up, and it was about 25 acres. And I said, well, if I wanted to put a fence around it, like a high tensile fence, how much would that cost? Well, know what I know of fencing. It's about $1.50 a foot for a 2-strand fence. Sure, that's expensive, and sure, maybe you don't need that as much, but if you're by a main road, you might want to consider that as an investment. Klaus talked about the watering. There's a ton of ways to water. You could put water on tanks. You could um, have a pump where you're pumping water to a tank and then leave it, and you might have to break the ice now and then. A smaller tank with more animals, the animals will keep it open more. Um, if you lay it on the ground, that's great. You can also access a stream. I would say as long as it's controlled drinking, that's hardened surface. Animals can actually walk a ways to get some water. Um, Portable loading, I don't care what kind of animal, you need a place to load and unload your enterprise. It's great if you can walk them over someplace, but it's always nice to have a loading area because something can happen. They might get sick. They might have a foot problem, or you just need to get them out of there after so many days of feed. And if you're going to use a truck, have it truck friendly. So always be thinking about those types of things. And then if you're going to manage, you should have portable fencing. And like on this example, I calculated with portable fence posts and poly wire on reels, you're talking about $700, give or take. That's to get animals moving efficiently across the landscape, and then so they won't waste as much. Again, totally our context. A lot of folks don't have to be quite as intensive. All depends on your context and your goals. So I just did a rough number of what that might cost, and I came up with about 11 grand, which kind of is a sort of a shocker, because you're saying, well, who's going to invest that kind of money? The guy that owns the land, or if you own the land, to get. But honestly, these fences and these things that we put up, I've put them up for almost 40 years now. There's hardly a fence that doesn't last 20 years. So honestly, if you amortized all that, I'd be looking at a $500 bill a year to have a field ready to do something. Again, maybe on the high side, maybe in Nebraska it's going to be half of that. Um, so, but if you amortize it over a lot of years, it's going to be pretty reasonable. So then I came down to the seeding. In our neck of the woods, I have got good sources of seeding rates of whether it's triticale or rye or other kinds of crops, single species seeded with equipment, drilled, could be less if it's broadcast, but you're not going to get quite the production. You're going to need more seed. So we're talking about $80 to $100, $110 an acre to get something seeded. If you're doing a multi-species cover crop, you're talking maybe 130 to 140. I've heard folks in the industry talk about even more money, but you're going to get more tonnage. Um, I even on this small example at $80, you got $2,000 in an establishment. So that's not chump change either. So I also went and did a kind of a ballpark grazing plan where I said there's going to be 4,800 pound heifers that need about 1,000 pounds of dry matter every day. And then I had to come up with a cover crop yield, and that was more difficult than I imagined because a cover crop yield isn't like a permanent pasture, and there is a fair bit of air. So, when you're drilling it in, you're going to have rows that have, 7-inch rows. There's going to be um some air in that tonnage. And then how tall is this? How dense is this cover crop you're putting in? It's I think Karen told me it'd be best to go out and do a cutting and try to calculate how much dry matter you think is growing there. I did it kind of from what I gathered from some of my sources that 10 inches of cover crop, especially like a rye or a triticale, yields about 1,500 pounds of dry matter per acre. Just because it's so wet. But given that I'm wrong, but I'm in the ballpark. So if an animal group like 225 sheep or 40 dairy heifers need 1,000 pounds of dry matter a day, and you've got 1,500 pounds growing out there, you only need a half an acre a day. So this 25 acres can provide you 42 days, give or take, of feed. I ask everyone here, what is that worth? Whether you're fighting a drought or you are in the summer or the fall, winter grazing or spring grazing, and you can get 42 days of grazing and save your pastures for something else, or maybe you want to make some hay crop. Just to break even on this, if I was to custom graze these dairy heifers at $1.50 a day, just break even. Those animals at 42 days, I would break even on the fence and the establishment. And you would actually feed animals. I'm confident it'd be worth way more than that because if you priced maintaining a dairy heifer on winter feed right now, you're probably looking at about $2.67 a head. So there's a lot of numbers that could be crunched to make this a lot more attractive. Plus, you're getting cover crops, you're getting manure and the biological activity, the manure, the urine. You're getting soil health benefits from these plants that are getting grazed. There's just a lot of win-win, even though it costs a fair bit to get this thing rolling. But it's exciting to do these back of the napkin. That's why it's good to keep talking amongst us practitioners. I like the grazing cover crops, but I also like what else can you do with that cover crop? So a lot of farms around this region and in Canada and all across the country are using cover crop grazing as their protein source, and then they send the animals back to do some bale grazing. Folks are also doing stockpile grazing. That's my granddaughter Hadley. If you have stockpile grazing, you can go back and forth. You can have some high protein cover crops to graze, and then you can send animals back to graze stockpile. Or you can use the cover crops to build more stockpile at your own farms. So And then now we have, this is Luke Gianforti. He's got a interseeder. So we're interseeding cover crops into corn when it's growing. So there's a lot of options on the table now. It's just a matter of figuring out which one works for your context. Klaus alluded to this, but logistically, thinking about our mindset is going to drive our adoption of these cover crop principles, these grazing principles, and figuring out how we're going to do this effectively here in the Northeast. We need some human trust and relationship building amongst farmers, even amongst our neighbors who think cows shouldn't be out on open ground in the winter. It'd be nice to integrate crops and livestock systems instead of separate. And I've heard more than my share of we can't do it here polarization. It's just too cold, it's too snowy, it's too this, it's too that. If they're doing it in South Dakota, I think we can probably adopt some stuff here in the Northeast, even though we are definitely wetter and our climate is weird. I like a mindset where all farmers win. So these grazing cover crops or any of these systems, we can't be adversarial, meaning if I bring animals over to graze your cover crops, you can't charge me an arm and a leg and make it so it's unprofitable for me. We have to find ways where our both entities can prosper. And we're obviously feeding America. So how do we integrate these stories into our narrative of, we're all trying to build soil and feed people. But as farmers, we need to make some money collectively and together. So I feel like there's a lot that we need to consider. So part of this is we need more practitioners like Klaus, like the folks I visited with. We need more pilot projects, field days, because that's how a lot of us learn. We can learn a lot of stuff from the ground. So I'm looking forward to working with Anne Marie and other groups to put together some of these smaller plot or whatever cover crop grazing we can do here in the Northeast. We need more practitioners to teach us, and we need some grazing champions out there to help us find a way to build some implementation strategies, especially when it comes around to fencing and all the things we've talked about today. And finally, my journey, Anne Marie kind of put a lot. She challenged me to think about this topic for our Northeast region. I've been to Vermont this year, Ohio, Virginia, and a lot of states where Pennsylvania, where I've literally gone from my house to Virginia and saw one cover crop grazing field. So there's a lot of room for improvement. It's all around the East. We've got a lot of opportunity, but in finding the solutions to these questions, I have a tremendous amount of respect for the folks on this list. I know Heather Darby is here in New York today talking with farmers in Geneva. She's super knowledgeable on this subject. Sarah Flack, who obviously does a lot of grazing consulting around the Northeast. Morgan Hartman, Understanding Ag and Gabe Brown have a big presence in integrating livestock. So this list isn't all encompassing, but these are the folks that have really helped me to learn about this subject and be more knowledgeable. And it's actually pretty exciting to have this many mentors at my disposal, especially on the phone or online. So I really appreciate carrying this message forward. So thank you. And Marie,
Thank you, Troy.
am I
Um,
unsharing?
yes, yes.
Okay.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Troy, so much for your presentation and for bringing Klaus on board to share his experience with cover crop. And thanks to everybody for tuning in today. Be sure to check out NatGLC's website and the many resources that Klaus has participated in online. He's a great Google search. There's plenty of videos and resources there. Also, remember that Farmers for Soil Health provides cover crop cost share opportunities, which you can learn more about at farmersforsoilhealth.com. A short survey will pop up for those of you hanging in there for your CCA credits. If you don't mind, we'd really appreciate your feedback. We also have another webinar coming up February 27th about goal-oriented cover cropping with Matt Kincaid. That information will be in a follow-up email you can expect next week, along with the recording, a link to the recording that will be on SHI's YouTube page, and another opportunity for some feedback. The registration link to the webinar is coming up in the chat also. Sorry, I just feel like we're on a time crunch. I'm trying to get all your information in. Going on to the CCA credit, you can access your 1 CCA Soil and Water CEU credit here. You can open up the app, your CCA mobile app, and click scan course code, or you can email Olivia the information that's requested on the screen, and she can help you get that secured. Olivia's email is also in the chat. Keep a lookout for the email, the recording, additional resources, and we're so happy to have you all here today. And thank you all so much for joining. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.